Take it down now. Cynthia Reynolds, HOA president, ordered with unflinching authority. Her gaze was fixed, and the neighbors stood in the background, observing. For the past week, she had claimed that my shed violated HOA regulations, calling it an eyesore. I'm not taking it down, I replied firmly. You don't control what I build on my property. Cynthia crossed her arms, unmoved. It's a violation, and I'll ensure it's removed. It's more than an eyesore, it's a threat to the community. I paused. A threat? What are you talking about? Her voice grew sharp. You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. This wasn't about the shed. It was about something more. Cynthia's persistence in framing it as a community danger was personal, and I realized I was facing a far deeper issue than a simple HOA complaint. Officer Peterson arrived at the property in response to Cynthia's complaint. He informed me that the shed violated HOA codes and that it needed to be removed. He presented the issue without question or room for discussion, citing the regulations that I was allegedly infringing upon. I responded by clarifying that the structure was not just an ordinary shed. It had purpose and history. The words felt inadequate for the explanation I wanted to provide, but I kept my composure. I tried to convey that it was more than a violation of code. It was a part of something important, something that went beyond the scope of what they were addressing. But Officer Peterson's response was dismissive, and his skepticism was evident. He asked for clarification, but I held back the full truth, uncertain if it was the right moment to reveal everything. The shed was far more than anyone realized, but revealing its true nature would bring unwanted attention. I told him vaguely, you'll see it for yourself soon enough. Despite the veiled hint, Peterson didn't seem interested in my reasoning. He responded by outlining his course of action. He gave me 24 hours to start dismantling the structure, threatening that if I failed to comply, a warrant would be issued for its removal. There was no room for negotiation or understanding. It was a directive, plain and simple. He left without another word. And I was left standing in front of the shed, processing the weight of his instructions. The reality of the situation set in. I had just been told to tear down a piece of history, a structure that meant something far deeper than a mere violation of regulations. But the world didn't care about what the shed truly represented. The history I carried in that structure was lost on everyone. The community's focus was on conformity, on adhering to rules that suited their aesthetic preferences. No one had any interest in the past or the significance of what lay hidden beneath the surface. To them, the shed was an eyesore, an inconvenience that stood in the way of their carefully curated neighborhood image. The truth remained buried inside, a history that no one wanted to acknowledge. Yet, it was clear now that protecting that history would require more than simply defending a shed. It would involve a confrontation with people who didn't understand, people who would only see the present and the immediate issue at hand. I knew I had 24 hours to make a decision. Either I could comply with the order and destroy something irreplaceable, or I could challenge the system that had made this situation possible. The fight wasn't just about the shed anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for what was worth preserving, and for the refusal to be silenced by the constraints of an arbitrary set of rules. In the following hours, I would have to prepare for what was to come. But for now, the weight of the situation was clear. No one cared about the history inside the shed, and if I didn't act quickly, it would be lost forever. The shed was built with purpose, not merely as a structure for storing tools or firewood. It was constructed by my grandfather in the aftermath of World War II, a time when the world had just witnessed unprecedented destruction. My father often recounted the story of how it came to be, describing my grandfather's dedication to building the shed with exacting precision. While the shed appeared to be just a simple wooden building to the untrained eye, it was far more than that. It held a history that had remained largely hidden until now. The shed, my grandfather had once said, was not just wood, it's history. At the time, those words seemed like an exaggeration, a nostalgic claim from a man who had lived through tumultuous times. He had served in a covert military operation during the war, but the full extent of his involvement had always been shrouded in secrecy. He never spoke in detail about the mission, and the conversations were always vague. I assumed he simply wanted to preserve memories of a time long past, a time he believed the world had moved on from. It wasn't until much later that I realized the significance of his cryptic words. The shed was built to hide something. It wasn't just a repository for tools or personal belongings. It concealed a war bunker, constructed as part of a secretive military initiative during the war. My grandfather had been involved in a clandestine operation that had never been made public. An operation that, as I would later come to understand, had been deemed classified and erased from the records of history. The bunker wasn't just a shelter, it was part of a network that was never intended to be found. I had discovered this truth in an old trunk in my grandfather's attic, a place I had frequently visited as a child, hidden beneath layers of dust and discarded memories. I found a series of old photographs, maps, and blueprints. These were the materials my grandfather had kept out of sight for decades, never telling anyone about their significance. The photographs depicted detailed plans of the bunker, reinforced walls, a system of underground tunnels, and cryptic markings scattered across the blueprints. My grandfather's involvement in this operation was never discussed openly, and these documents were the only clues that remained of what he had been part of during the war. The significance of the markings and the design of the bunker became evident to me as I spent more time studying the blueprints. They were clearly not the work of an ordinary construction project. These were military designs, crafted to conceal and protect something far more important than a simple shelter. It was in these moments that I began to understand my grandfather's obsession with the shed. To him, it wasn't just a piece of his past, it was a symbol of something hidden and forgotten by the world. He had built it to protect something from being erased, not just from the physical world, but from the collective memory of history. The shed was a reminder of a time when secrets were kept, and the people involved in those secrets were expected to fade into the background once their roles were completed. But my grandfather had kept these memories close, even if he never fully explained them to anyone. In the years that followed, the shed remained untouched, standing as a silent witness to the passage of time. I never fully grasped its importance until I began to see the structure in a new light. The shed wasn't just a relic of my grandfather's life. It was a crucial link to an unspoken chapter in history. It had been carefully constructed to withstand the test of time, and the materials used were meant to ensure that whatever it concealed remained intact. The events leading up to the HOA's complaint now made sense. The complaints about the shed, which had initially seemed petty and unfounded, were part of something larger. Someone had uncovered the truth about the shed's hidden history, and the HOA's complaints were merely the first step in an effort to erase it. This wasn't about aesthetics or neighborhood conformity. It was about silencing a part of history that had never been meant to be found. The history concealed within the shed wasn't just about the bunker itself. It was about the people involved in its creation, the mission it supported, and the lengths to which those people had gone to protect it from being discovered. What had once seemed like a trivial conflict with the HOA now appeared to be the beginning of a much larger struggle. The war bunker that my grandfather had built was no longer just a piece of personal history. It had become a target, and I had become its defender. The realization hit hard. The government, or some other entity with vested interests, was working to erase the traces of this hidden history. The HOA's complaints were only the beginning. The effort to dismantle the shed was part of a broader attempt to eliminate any evidence of the operation my grandfather had been involved in. It was a systematic attempt to bury the past, to ensure that no one would ever discover the truth of what had taken place during those secretive war years. As I began to understand the full scope of what was at stake, I knew I couldn't back down. The shed wasn't just an eyesore to the HOA or a nuisance to the neighbors. It was a piece of history that needed to be preserved, no matter the cost. I was no longer just fighting to keep a structure on my property. I was fighting to protect a story that had been hidden for far too long. Cynthia had dismissed my previous attempts at explaining the significance of the shed. She focused solely on its appearance, labeling it a violation of HOA guidelines and a blight on the neighborhood. Despite her disinterest, I had to make one final attempt to force her to understand the truth, to show her that this tip wasn't merely a question of aesthetics or rules. It was a matter of history and preservation, something far more important than her narrow view of what belonged in the community. I approached her house with the intention of presenting the facts, not just the facts about the shed but about its historical significance. The argument had to shift away from her subjective opinions and toward objective evidence. The shed wasn't just an outdated structure. It was a relic of the past, tied to wartime efforts and to my family's legacy. And yet, it seemed that Cynthia and her husband had no intention of acknowledging that. I started the conversation by telling Cynthia directly, "You don't know what you're messing with." Her reaction was immediate, defensive, and dismissive. She dismissed my claim as irrelevant, reducing it to another inconvenience in her pristine neighborhood. "It's just a violation," she said, implying that nothing more was at stake. It was clear to me that she didn't see the value in the history I was trying to protect. For her, the rules existed to be followed, and anything outside that was simply a problem to be removed. She couldn't see beyond her own rigid perspective, and that made the conversation all the more difficult. But I wasn't going to back down. I insisted, "It's not just a shed. It's a historic war bunker, a piece of history you can't erase just because it makes you uncomfortable." The words felt heavy with meaning, but her reaction was predictable. She laughed off the claim. "That's a ridiculous claim," she retorted, dismissing the notion outright. It was clear she didn't want to engage with anything that didn't fit into her limited worldview. This is just an eyesore, a dilapidated shack, she added, cementing her stance that the shed was nothing more than a nuisance that should be removed without question. Despite her dismissal, I persisted. Do you even know what's inside? I asked, leaning in slightly. Do you care? She looked at me blankly, her indifference more pronounced than before. It was clear that she wasn't interested in learning the truth. Her only concern was her perception of the shed and how it fit into her neat, orderly vision of the neighborhood. The history inside the shed, the significance of its construction, and the reasons behind it meant nothing to her. It became obvious that the conflict wasn't really about the shed itself. Cynthia wasn't concerned with historical preservation or cultural significance. She was concerned with maintaining control, with enforcing a set of standards that she believed everyone should follow without question. Her actions weren't motivated by a sense of duty to the community but by a desire to ensure conformity, to eliminate anything that threatened the image of perfection she had created. Her focus was entirely on what she could see, what she could control, and how she could shape the environment around her. As she continued to disregard the importance of the shed, I realized the extent to which she was willing to sacrifice the truth for her own comfort. You only care about control, I said, my voice steady but firm, and I won't let you destroy something that matters. Her reaction was predictable. She barely even acknowledged the truth in my words. The shed was not just a structure. It was a marker of history, a representation of a time that had been hidden and forgotten. But to her, it was simply an eyesore. At that moment, her husband, who had been quiet throughout our exchange, stepped forward. His expression was cold, and his words even more so. You have no right to make these claims, he said, challenging my authority to even suggest that the shed held any value beyond its function as a storage unit. You're just trying to stall, he added, as though I was simply delaying the inevitable. But I wasn't stalling. I was standing firm on what I knew to be true. I'm trying to protect something that matters, I said, my voice more resolute than ever. The shed was more than a structure to me. It was a piece of my family's past, something that had been built with care and purpose. To simply tear it down without understanding what it represented would be a disservice to history. As I walked away from the conversation, I knew that this wasn't the end. Cynthia and her husband were not going to relent so easily, but in that moment, I had made my stand. The truth had been presented, whether they chose to accept it or not. The shed wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of something greater, something that could not be erased by their narrow viewpoint. The fight was far from over, but the seed of doubt had been planted. They would see soon enough what the shed truly represented. The court session opened with a clear focus on the HOA's claim that the shed violated neighborhood guidelines. Cynthia's legal team was swift in presenting their case, emphasizing the perceived damage to community aesthetics. The argument was simple. The shed was an eyesore that needed to be removed to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood. There was no consideration for its history, only the violation of HOA regulations. When it was my turn to present, the judge immediately addressed me. Mr. Johnson, you failed to prove that this shed is anything more than a nuisance. The evidence is clear. The HOA regulations are not to be ignored. I responded, knowing the stakes of this moment. Your Honor, this is not just about a structure. It's about preserving a piece of history that has been overlooked for decades. I outlined the importance of the shed beyond its physical appearance, explaining its role as a war bunker built during World War II, designed to serve as a hidden part of a military operation. I was prepared to present evidence to back up my claims. I presented the documents from my grandfather's collection. Old photographs, military blueprints, and letters that had been kept hidden in the family for years. These items, which clearly identified the shed's function as part of a classified mission, were the key pieces of evidence that I had hoped would shed light on the true significance of the structure. The courtroom buzzed as the images were projected for the judge and jury to see. The room was silent for a moment as everyone processed the implications of what had been presented. The judge paused, hand hovering over the gavel, as if he had not fully anticipated the gravity of the evidence. Cynthia's attorney quickly objected, arguing that the historical claim had no bearing on the case and that it should be dismissed as irrelevant to the question of code violations. But the judge remained silent, and I could see a subtle shift in his demeanor as he processed the new information. The conversation turned to whether the historical nature of the shed could influence the legal decision. The judge acknowledged the complexity of the situation, but the focus remained on the primary issue, whether the HOA's regulations had been violated. However, the evidence had been introduced, and it was clear that the case had shifted from a simple property dispute to something more substantial. By the end of the session, the judge decided to delay the ruling. The need for further investigation into the shed's historical importance was acknowledged. Cynthia's lawyer pushed to have the case dismissed, but the judge ruled that the evidence required additional review, thus suspending any immediate action regarding the demolition of the shed. This ruling allowed for a brief period of relief, but the outcome was not guaranteed. The next steps were critical, as I would need to continue to prove that the shed was more than a simple violation of community rules. The legal battle was far from over, but the introduction of the historical evidence had already shifted the momentum in my favor. The next phase of the case would determine whether history could hold its place against the pressures of modern-day regulation. The photographs, blueprints, and military files I presented had shifted the course of the hearing. What had once been dismissed as an eyesore was now being scrutinized as a structure of historical value. The documents clearly illustrated the shed's connection to a covert military operation, a fact that was previously unknown to the court. The material evidence revealed an undeniable truth that could no longer be ignored. The prosecutor, who had initially dismissed the claim as irrelevant, now looked at the evidence with a new sense of urgency. The shift was immediate. The documents presented were hard to dispute, even by those who had initially questioned their authenticity. The skepticism that had marked the opening stages of the case was now replaced by doubt. The significance of the shed was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was a fact, supported by tangible evidence that spoke for itself. Cynthia's lawyer attempted to regain control, trying to frame the evidence as irrelevant to the legal matters at hand. His argument focused on the idea that historical significance did not supersede the rules of the HOA. However, the more he argued, the clearer it became that he had underestimated the power of the evidence. His attempts to downplay the importance of the documents were ineffective against the undeniable truth they presented. Then, a direct response to Cynthia's lawyer, I addressed the core issue. You've spent years trying to erase something you didn't understand, I said, making it clear that the fight was not just about the shed, but about the attempt to erase a piece of history. The comment was pointed, focusing not only on the legal dispute but also on the deeper implications of disregarding the past. The legal framework could be manipulated, but the truth had a way of revealing itself, even in the most carefully constructed arguments. The judge, who had remained mostly silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat and called for order. His gavel came down, signaling a pause in the proceedings. We will review this new evidence, he said, acknowledging that the material presented required further consideration. The decision was suspended, and the court was adjourned for the day. The immediate impact of the judge's statement was clear. The case was no longer just a procedural matter. The introduction of historical evidence had complicated the issue, making it more than just a conflict over community guidelines. The fight had shifted from a simple regulation dispute to a more complex examination of historical preservation versus modern legal frameworks. The judge's ruling provided a brief respite, but it also indicated that the court would need time to fully consider the weight of the new evidence before making a final decision. For the time being, the immediate threat of demolition had been averted, but the outcome was still uncertain. The legal battle would continue, and the next steps would be critical. However, the turning point had been reached. The truth had emerged, and it was no longer something that could be easily dismissed. The verdict was delivered a week after the court session, confirming that the shed would remain standing. The legal challenge against it had been dismissed, and the historical importance of the structure had been recognized. Cynthia's attempt to have the shed removed, based on the grounds of HOA regulations, had been unsuccessful. The evidence I presented regarding the shed's historical significance outweighed the claims of it being an eyesore. The ruling represented more than a mere victory in a property dispute. It was a validation of the importance of preserving history, especially in a society quick to dismiss anything that doesn't fit neatly within modern expectations. The shed was not just a structure, it was a part of a hidden past, a relic of a time that had shaped the present. The court's acknowledgement of its value set a precedent for how historical importance could be considered in future cases. The response from the community shifted as well. Neighbors who had once viewed the shed with disdain now regarded it with a renewed sense of respect. They saw it not as an obstruction to their idealized version of the neighborhood, but as a reminder of the complexity of history, something that transcended their immediate concerns about property values and aesthetics. Cynthia, despite her continued efforts to paint the situation as one of mere negligence, had failed to achieve her goal. While she might have won smaller skirmishes in the past, the truth had ultimately prevailed. The shed was allowed to stand. But more importantly, the story of its significance had been acknowledged by those who had the power to remove it. It was a victory not just for the preservation of the shed, but for the preservation of history itself. The lesson was clear. Some things, even those hidden away in sheds, are worth defending.